There is a distinct, inescapable, metallic scent to a combat deployment that never really leaves your uniform. It's a suffocating, heavy blend of JP-8 aviation fuel, burnt cordite, superheated tarmac, and the fine, alkaline desert dust that somehow manages to work its way into the pores of your skin and the fire-resistant threads of your Nomex flight suit. When you spend 14 hours a day strapped inside the armored titanium cage of an AH-64 Apache helicopter, your brain undergoes a necessary, fundamental structural shift. You are piloting a $35 million machine built for one singular purpose: total, unmitigated destruction. You fly close air support and reconnaissance missions where the margin of error is measured in fractions of a second. Out here in the sandbox, the ambient air temperature hovers at 115 degrees in the shade. A single momentary lapse in focus, a slight miscalculation of crosswinds during a gun run, or a split-second delay in deploying flares against a surface-to-air threat, and you come home in a zinc-lined transfer case draped in a flag. To survive that kind of relentless, soul-crushing psychological pressure for 18 months at a time, you have to learn how to compartmentalize. You take the fear, the bone-deep exhaustion, the deafening roar of the twin turboshaft engines, and the crushing weight of the lives depending on you on the ground, and you lock them all away in a dark, airtight box in the back of your mind. But to keep that box securely closed, you need an anchor. You need one pristine, quiet place in your memory to retreat to when you finally power down the avionics, unclip your 5-point harness, and step out onto the flight line in the dead of night. For me, that anchor wasn't a person. It wasn't a memory of a childhood bedroom, and it certainly wasn't the thought of a chaotic family waiting stateside. It was a very specific set of GPS coordinates in the American Northwest. 520 acres of old-growth Douglas fir rugged elevation and completely undisturbed wilderness in the state of Montana. It wasn't just a piece of real estate to me. It was an inheritance from my late grandfather, and more importantly, it was a profound statement of trust. My grandfather was a hard, quiet man. He survived the freezing, blood-soaked mud of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea and came back to build a life with heavily calloused hands and absolutely zero complaints. He was a structural ironworker who spent 45 years building bridges across the Midwest. He poured every dime he ever saved into buying that massive parcel of land. He didn't want a mansion. He didn't care about luxury vehicles or country club memberships. He just wanted a piece of the earth that belonged completely and exclusively to him. A place where the air was clean, the water ran clear from subterranean aquifers, and the toxic noise of the modern world could not reach him. He had watched over the decades with quiet, simmering disgust as his own children, my mother, my father, and my uncles, spent their adult lives chasing cheap thrills, accumulating suffocating credit card debt, and looking for lazy shortcuts to wealth that inevitably ended in bankruptcy courts or tearful phone calls begging for bailouts. They were financial vultures. When it came time for my grandfather to write his will, as he lay dying in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital room, he didn't divide his legacy among the sons and daughters who would have immediately sold it off to the first strip mining conglomerate or corporate timber company that waved a check in their faces. He bypassed an entire generation of financial incompetence and reckless greed. He left the deed free and clear, squarely in my name. I was 19 years old when he died, just entering the grueling washout pipeline of Army flight school. The estate attorney handed me a thick manila envelope containing the original deed and a short, handwritten note from my grandfather that contained exactly 2 sentences. "You know the value of discipline, Carter. Don't let the parasites turn our sanctuary into a parking lot." To the county tax assessor, the property was just parcel ID 409, a high-value stretch of undeveloped agricultural and timberland. To me, it was holy ground. It was the only piece of the civilian world I actually cared about preserving. It was my designated extraction point. The one place I planned to disappear to when the army was finally done wearing down my cartilage and fraying my nerves. But the military apparatus doesn't care about your civilian attachments or your grandfather's dying wishes. When United States Army Human Resources Command hands you orders for a high-tempo overseas deployment, you face a severe logistical nightmare. You can't exactly pack up half a mountain and take it with you in a canvas duffel bag to a forward operating base. Owning raw land is not a passive endeavor. Montana winters are brutally unforgiving. Deadfall needs to be cleared from the access roads so the county doesn't fine you. Property taxes need to be paid to the municipal treasurer on a strict quarterly schedule, or the government will put a tax lien on the deed and auction it off. Most importantly, the 5 miles of heavy, barbed wire perimeter fence needs to be walked periodically to ensure local poachers, illegal loggers, or squatters aren't treating my sanctuary like public property. An unmonitored piece of land that massive is a magnet for trouble. I couldn't do any of that from 7,000 miles away, operating on a 12-hour time difference with sporadic, heavily encrypted internet access. I needed a warden on the ground. I needed someone who could physically drive out to the property once a month, check the heavy steel padlocks, pay the county treasurer with my funds, and leave the land exactly as it was. Logic dictated I hire a professional, bonded property management firm. But family politics, combined with a perfectly executed guilt trip, dictated otherwise. My biological uncle Arthur found out about my deployment orders before I even had the chance to pack my bags. Arthur was a man who had spent his entire 55 years on Earth playing the role of the misunderstood, salt-of-the-earth country boy. He wore faded Carhartt jackets, drove a beat-up Ford truck that he constantly complained about, and spoke with a slow, folksy drawl that made him sound like a man of deep traditional values. In reality, he was a chronic opportunist. He had spent his life bouncing between failed multi-level marketing schemes, unpaid personal loans, and vague business ventures that always seemed to require someone else's startup capital. But when he sat at my kitchen table a week before I shipped out, nursing a cup of black coffee and looking at me with misty, earnest eyes, he played his hand perfectly. "Your granddad and I had our differences, Carter. I won't deny that," he had said, staring down at his weathered hands, his voice thick with practiced emotion. "But that land is family blood. You're going off to serve our country. You're putting your life on the line. You shouldn't have to pay some faceless, blood-sucking corporation to watch over your own grandfather's dirt. Let me do it. I live 40 miles away. I'll check the fences. I'll pay the taxes. I'll do it. To honor the old man and to keep your mind at ease while you're up in the air. Consider it my way of serving." It was an exceptional pitch. It sounded right. It sounded exactly like a man seeking redemption, trying to bridge a bitter generational divide. But as an Army Aviation officer, my survival depends on contingency planning, threat assessment, and a fundamental refusal to operate on blind faith. Trust is a severe vulnerability, and in the military, you mitigate vulnerabilities through strict protocol. I wanted to believe him, but I knew his history. I knew the exact way he looked at money, so I didn't just hand him a set of keys and a handshake. I went straight to the Judge Advocate General's office on post. I sat down with Captain Miller, a razor-sharp JAG attorney who specialized in service member asset protection. For 3 exhausting hours, we drafted a special power of attorney. I explained exactly who my uncle was, his history of financial recklessness, and exactly what I needed to prevent him from doing while I was out of the country. Most soldiers just sign a general power of attorney when they deploy, Captain Miller had noted, tapping his pen on his legal pad. It lets a relative handle everything: bank accounts, vehicles, real estate. It's quick and convenient. "I don't want convenience, sir," I replied, my voice perfectly flat. "I want a financial straitjacket. I need a limited power of attorney so intensely restricted that my uncle cannot even buy a cup of coffee without violating federal law." Captain Miller smiled. He understood exactly what I was asking for. The resulting legal document was a masterpiece of legal paranoia. The parameters were explicitly clear and completely non-negotiable. Article 4, Section B of the document explicitly stated that Arthur had zero authority to sell, lease, sublease, develop, log rezone, or alter a single square inch of the property. He could not sign any contracts on my behalf. He could not use the land as collateral for a loan. He had zero fiduciary authority over the deed itself. His legal capacity was strictly and aggressively limited to two administrative functions, withdrawing exactly $800 a quarter from a dedicated, low-balance checking account I had set up specifically to cover the county property taxes, and purchasing basic hardware like padlocks or barbed wire to maintain the perimeter fence. That was the entirety of his legal mandate. Simple, clean, and legally bulletproof. I handed him the notarized document, along with a single brass key to the main gate. For the first 10 months of my deployment, his reports came in like clockwork. Every other Friday, usually around 0400 my time, an email would hit my military inbox. The subject line was always exactly the same: Monthly Sit Rep, The Farm. The messages were short, folksy, and immensely comforting in their mundane nature. He would detail the shifting weather patterns, complain mildly about the rising price of diesel fuel, and assure me the municipal taxes were paid in full. More importantly, he always attached pictures to prove that my sanctuary was safe. There would be a high-resolution shot of the lush green canopy at dawn, the morning fog rolling off the pine needles, a picture of a small herd of white-tailed deer grazing peacefully near the main creek bed. A close-up of the heavy steel gate securely padlocked, the thick chain completely undisturbed. "Everything is exactly how you left it, Carter," he wrote in what would be his final message before the illusion shattered completely. "The perimeter is secure. No trespassers. The water is running clear. Keep your head down over there. Do your job and come home safe. Your uncle has the home front locked down." I would sit in the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by the glow of encrypted radio screens and the low hum of military servers, drinking stale, burnt coffee. I would open those attachments, stare at the vibrant, untouched green of the Montana forest, and feel a profound, grounding sense of peace. It was exactly what a tired, stressed pilot needed to see. It was the perfect narrative: a loyal uncle setting aside past grievances, faithfully protecting his niece's legacy while she was at war. But if thousands of hours in a combat aircraft have taught me anything, it's that the human eye is easily deceived. People on the ground will only ever show you the exact angle they want you to see. A photograph is just a carefully cropped version of reality, and everything outside of that frame is a heavily guarded secret. Arthur thought that thousands of miles of ocean made me effectively blind. He looked at my grandfather's pristine wilderness, the untouched soil, the isolated geography, and he didn't see a family legacy. He didn't see honor. He saw a dark, empty void. A place where the law didn't reach. A place waiting to be leased off in the dead of night to the highest, dirtiest bidder. He thought he could bury his secrets in my soil, poison my water, and walk away a rich man while I was busy bleeding for my country. He just forgot one crucial, catastrophic detail about what I do for a living. I am an Army Aviation officer. I don't rely on pictures taken from the dirt by people with a vested interest in lying. When I need to see the absolute, unfiltered truth of a battlefield, I don't ask for a localized report. I rely on the unblinking, unmerciful view from orbit. And the sky never lies. Dưới đây là clean transcript cho hồi 2 Act 2. Bản thảo tiếp tục duy trì kỹ thuật Deep Dive Storytelling, đảm bảo thời lượng 1550 từ chuẩn 11-12 phút audio. Hồi này tập trung vào kỹ năng phân tích tình báo hình ảnh IMINT, sự phát hiện lạnh gáy qua dữ liệu quang phổ và tư duy phòng thủ pháp lý đỉnh cao của Carter, đạo luật Superfund. Tuyệt đối 100% tiếng Anh Mỹ, không ghi chú đạo diễn, văn phòng sắc bén, tĩnh lặng và tàn khốc. The Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, is the central nervous system of any forward-deployed aviation element. At 0300 hours, when the rest of the base is submerged in the exhausted, fitful sleep that only combat zones can provide, the TOC remains deliberately, aggressively awake. It is a massive, heavily fortified bunker, kept at a freezing 65 degrees by industrial air conditioning units, designed to prevent the towers of military-grade servers from melting down in the desert heat. The air inside is completely sterile, smelling faintly of ozone, burnt electrical wire, and heavily caffeinated anxiety. The room is permanently bathed in the low, blue-tinted glow of dozens of high-definition monitors. Most of them display encrypted, classified feeds, unmanned drone surveillance circling hostile territory, live troop tracking grids, and real-time threat assessments. But there are also secondary terminals. Machines connected to commercial geospatial intelligence databases and global mapping software, used for basic topographical familiarization route deconfliction and environmental analysis. It was during one of these dead-of-night shifts, while I was waiting for a delayed intelligence briefing to download, that I decided to look at home. It wasn't out of suspicion. Not initially. It was just an overwhelming sense of fatigue. My eyes were burning from staring at endless stretches of hostile, sand-swept topography. I needed a psychological reset. I needed to see something green. I pulled a keyboard toward me, opened a high-resolution commercial satellite imaging portal that we contracted for terrain analysis, and typed in the exact GPS coordinates of my grandfather's property in Montana. The software took a few seconds to buffer through the encrypted network, retrieving the most recent orbital pass captured from a low Earth orbit satellite just 24 hours prior. A loading wheel spun in the center of the screen, and then the high-resolution composite image resolved. I leaned back in my ergonomic mesh chair, bringing a lukewarm mug of black coffee to my lips, expecting to see the unbroken emerald canopy of the old-growth Douglas firs. I expected to see the narrow, undisturbed dirt access road winding peacefully up toward the natural subterranean springs. I didn't see either of those things. The coffee froze in the back of my throat. I set the mug down on the steel desk so slowly, so deliberately, that it didn't make a single sound. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glowing monitor, my brain rapidly trying to process the violent contradiction between the folksy reassurances my uncle had been emailing me and the brutal reality the satellite was displaying. When you spend hundreds of hours looking at the Earth from the cockpit of an attack helicopter, your eyes become highly calibrated to geometric anomalies. Nature does not build in straight lines. Nature does not create perfect 90-degree angles, and nature certainly doesn't carve 20-foot wide swaths of exposed dirt through dense timber. The first glaring anomaly was the main access road. My grandfather had built it for a single, standard-sized pickup truck. It was meant to be narrow, heavily shaded, and slightly overgrown. But the orbital image showed a wide, deeply rutted gash of exposed, churned brown earth tearing through the tree line. The trees on either side hadn't just been trimmed. They had been violently bulldozed and pushed aside to widen the turn radius. The second anomaly was the clearing. Deep inside the property, near the center where the elevation dipped into a natural bowl toward the aquifer, a massive section of the forest floor had been completely hollowed out. I placed both hands flat on the desk. My heart rate didn't spike, I didn't gasp, and I didn't panic. When an Army Aviator encounters a catastrophic system failure in the air, panic gets you killed. You don't scream at the instrument panel. You analyze the data, you isolate the failure, and you execute emergency procedures. I treated the monitor exactly like a failing turbine engine. I needed more data. I brought up the digital caliper tool on the geospatial software and dragged the cursor across the tire tracks leading into the massive clearing. The mathematics were undeniable. The wheelbase distance was far too wide for a standard domestic truck. The turning radius required to make those deep semicircles in the mud was massive, requiring heavy, reinforced suspension. These weren't pickup trucks checking a fence line. They were commercial 18-wheelers, heavy freight logistics vehicles operating deep inside a protected forest. I opened a secondary window on my terminal and logged into my personal military email. I pulled up the last monthly sitrep Arthur had sent me just 5 days ago. I opened the beautiful, pristine picture of the locked steel gate and the untouched forest. I downloaded his image file and ran it through a basic metadata extractor, a tool that pulls the hidden digital footprint embedded in every digital photograph. The EXIF data popped up on my screen in stark white text. The date the photo was captured wasn't 5 days ago. It was from late October 3 years ago. I checked the picture of the deer grazing from the month before. 4 years ago. He was recycling old archived photos. He had likely spent one afternoon taking dozens of pictures from different angles, stripped the timestamps, and had been feeding me a carefully curated loop of visual lies for nearly a year. He was keeping me sedated and ignorant while he tore my grandfather's sanctuary to shreds. But why, if he was illegally logging the timber to sell it, there would be massive stacks of felled trees waiting for transport? There were none. If he was doing unpermitted construction, there would be concrete foundations or heavy excavators left on site. The clearing was empty. Vehicles of massive weight were driving miles into my isolated property, stopping at the natural depression near the water table and leaving. To understand what was actually happening, I had to stop looking at the visible spectrum of light. I switched the satellite imaging software from standard optical to multispectral infrared imaging, specifically targeting the NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. In military reconnaissance, we use this filter to find camouflaged enemy bunkers hidden in dense jungles or forests. Healthy living vegetation absorbs visible light and reflects near-infrared light incredibly well. Dead or dying vegetation absorbs the infrared. On an NDVI scan, a healthy forest glows in vibrant hot colors, like bright red or orange. When the multispectral filter applied to my property, the image on my screen turned into a literal nightmare. The edges of the property near the highway were healthy, but emanating from the center of that bulldozed clearing creeping downward through the soil, directly toward the underground freshwater spring, was a massive, sprawling stain of pitch black and sickly gray. It looked like a rotting, necrotic wound on an X-ray. The root systems of the ancient pines, the underbrush, the soil itself, it was all dying at a catastrophic, highly accelerated rate. It wasn't a forest fire. There was no thermal ash signature. It wasn't a localized drought. It was a severe chemical burn. The realization hit me with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The 18-wheelers, the utter secrecy, the dying soil. Arthur wasn't building anything. He was treating my grandfather's sacred ground as an unregulated, off-the-books dumping site. In the environmental and hazardous waste underworld, they call it midnight dumping. Chemical manufacturing plants, industrial refineries, and fracking operations face millions of dollars in federal compliance fees to legally treat and dispose of toxic byproducts. To bypass those massive operational costs, corrupt waste brokers will find isolated, unmonitored land. They pay someone off in raw cash and empty thousands of gallons of caustic, hazardous sludge directly into the earth under the cover of darkness. Arthur was leasing out my pristine wilderness to corporate polluters. He was letting them poison the aquifer, murder the soil, and permanently contaminate the local ecosystem, all so he could line his pockets, while the legal owner of the land was 7,000 miles away fighting a war. I needed to see the price tag of his treason. I minimized the satellite imagery and opened a standard web browser. I routed my connection through a secure VPN, bypassing the military firewalls to access stateside public records. First, I checked the Flathead County Clerk's public database. I searched his name and my property's parcel number. 0 commercial permits filed, 0 land disturbance or zoning requests. Everything was completely under the radar. Next, I went to the most common fatal vulnerability of the modern criminal, an inflated ego. I typed Arthur's name into Facebook from a dummy intelligence-gathering profile. His account was set to public. There he was. In a photo uploaded exactly 3 weeks ago, Arthur was standing in the paved driveway of his modest suburban home. He was wearing his faded Carhartt jacket, but he was leaning proudly against the hood of a brand-new, factory-fresh Ford F-350 Super Duty King Ranch Edition. The truck was a colossal, heavy-duty dually behemoth painted metallic black, complete with off-road trim and a custom grille. I knew the automotive market well enough to do the math. With dealership markups, that specific trim package retailed for no less than $85,000. I scrolled down to read his caption. God is good. Hard work finally paying off. Sometimes the universe just rewards you for being patient. Paid in full. Cash is king. Paid in full. Cash is king. $85,000 in undeclared liquid cash for a man who hadn't held a steady W-2 wage job in a decade. A man whose only current legal employment was withdrawing exactly $800 a quarter to pay my property taxes. He was getting rich off the slow, toxic murder of my inheritance. For a brief, fleeting moment, a visceral, blinding rage flared in the center of my chest. The kind of primal anger that makes you want to pick up a satellite phone, call a family member, and scream until your vocal cords tear. The kind of anger that makes you want to request immediate emergency leave, fly home, kick down a door, and put a man against a wall by his throat. But I am not an amateur, and I do not operate on emotion. I forced the anger down into that dark, airtight box in the back of my mind, locked it, and looked at the situation with the cold, calculating eyes of a military strategist. If I called Arthur right now and confronted him, he would deny it. He would hang up, pack a bag, drain his bank accounts, and vanish into the wind with his dirty cash. And he would leave me holding something far deadlier than a stolen inheritance. He would leave me holding total federal liability. In the United States, environmental contamination is governed by a terrifying, uncompromising piece of legislation known as CERCLA, more commonly referred to as the Superfund law. The Environmental Protection Agency does not operate on fairness or intent. They operate on a legal doctrine known as strict joint and several liability. That means the federal government doesn't care if you were deployed in a combat zone in a completely different hemisphere when the toxic waste was dumped. If your name is on the deed to the land, you are classified as the potentially responsible party. You are the one legally on the hook for the environmental remediation. And cleaning up a heavily contaminated subterranean aquifer doesn't cost thousands of dollars. It costs millions. Arthur wasn't just stealing from me. He was unknowingly loading a legal shotgun, pressing the barrel directly against my forehead and preparing to pull the trigger. If the EPA or the State Department of Environmental Quality found this toxic site before I did, they would seize my assets. They would garnish my military pension, destroy my security clearance, and potentially charge me with environmental negligence. Arthur was going to walk away a wealthy man, and I was going to spend the rest of my life in suffocating federal debt paying for the poison he buried in my grandfather's soil. I stared at the picture of him, smiling in front of his new truck. The harsh blue light of the TOC reflected off my unblinking eyes. He thinks he's so smart, I thought, the hum of the cooling servers suddenly sounding like a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. He thinks because he's hiding in the dark out in the middle of nowhere, he is completely untouchable. He didn't realize that by bringing unregulated industrial hazardous waste into the equation, he hadn't just broken a family promise. He had crossed directly into the jurisdiction of the most heavily armed, financially ruthless regulatory agencies in the United States government. I wasn't going to call him. I wasn't going to warn him. I wasn't going to give him a single second to prepare a defense. I was going to build a federal cage so legally airtight and so utterly devastating that he would beg for the mercy of a regular prison cell. I minimized his smiling face, closed the browser, and opened a fresh, heavily encrypted email draft on the military network. I typed in the address for the United States Army Judge Advocate General's office. It was time to introduce my uncle to the Environmental Protection Agency. In the civilian sector, when an individual discovers they have been profoundly betrayed by their own blood, the immediate instinct is to initiate confrontation. A civilian will pick up a phone, scream into the receiver, demand an explanation, or hire a litigator to draft a heavily worded cease and desist letter. It is a loud, chaotic, highly emotional reaction, driven entirely by the desire to inflict immediate psychological pain. The United States military operates on an entirely different doctrine of conflict resolution. We are taught from the very first day of officer candidate school that noise is a fatal tactical vulnerability. Noise warns the enemy. It alerts them to your presence, granting them precious time to fortify their positions, destroy critical evidence, and prepare countermeasures. Silence, on the other hand, is a weapon of mass destruction. When you know exactly what your adversary is doing, and they have absolutely no idea that you possess that intelligence, you hold absolute, unmitigated leverage over their existence. I was not going to make a sound. I was going to let my Uncle Arthur gorge himself on his own arrogance until he choked on it. Sitting in the freezing blue-lit hum of the Tactical Operations Center, I didn't throw my coffee mug against the wall. I didn't let my heart rate spike. I simply minimized the commercial satellite portal, opened a heavily encrypted military communication terminal, and began drafting a strike package. I compiled an exhaustively detailed intelligence dossier. I attached the high-resolution orbital imagery, clearly showing the wide, unauthorized vehicular tracks bulldozed through my grandfather's virgin timber. I included the multispectral infrared NDVI scans highlighting the necrotic dead zone in the vegetation, proving a massive, ongoing chemical leak. I attached the extracted EXIF data, proving Arthur's systematic falsification of his monthly photographic reports, confirming he was actively concealing the operation. Finally, I included the screenshot of his public social media profile, proudly displaying an $85,000 cash vehicle purchase. I routed the file through a secure military channel directly to Captain Miller, the exact same Judge Advocate General Attorney who had meticulously drafted my suffocating limited power of attorney 10 months prior. The subject line of the email was clinically precise: imminent federal liability, severe environmental contamination, requesting immediate agency liaison. Captain Miller responded exactly 4 hours later. His message was brief, completely devoid of pleasantries, and deeply serious. He requested an immediate secure video teleconference over the SIPR net, the military's classified, heavily encrypted communications protocol. When I logged into a terminal inside a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF, Miller's face appeared on the high-definition monitor. He looked exceptionally grim. As a military attorney specializing in asset protection for deployed personnel, he understood the exact magnitude of the disaster I was currently facing. Chief Warrant Officer Carter Miller started, his tone strictly professional, his eyes locked on the camera. I have thoroughly reviewed your intelligence packet. The data is undeniable. But we are no longer dealing with a simple breach of fiduciary duty or familial fraud. Midnight dumping of hazardous waste is a direct, catastrophic violation of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, and the Clean Water Act. It is a federal felony. I am acutely aware of the criminal statutes, sir, I replied, my voice perfectly flat. But my immediate concern is civil liability. Under CERCLA, the Superfund law, the Environmental Protection Agency operates on a terrifying legal doctrine known as strict joint and several liability. They do not care about intent, and they do not care that I have been 7,000 miles away fighting a war. Because my name is the only name on that deed, the federal government categorizes me as the potentially responsible party. If a local county inspector finds that site before we establish a defensive perimeter, the EPA will hold me legally and financially responsible for a multi-million-dollar remediation. They will garnish my military pay, liquidate my assets, destroy my security clearance, and potentially charge me with environmental negligence. Exactly. Miller nodded, his tone shifting to predatory legal precision. But we have a shield. The limited power of attorney we drafted before you deployed is our armor. Because Article 4 explicitly forbade him from altering the land operating heavy machinery or entering into commercial leases, his actions constitute gross fraud and criminal trespass. He acted entirely as a rogue agent. Combined with your deployment orders and the forged photographic evidence proving he actively concealed the dumping, we have the exact legal ammunition required to claim the innocent landowner defense under federal law. We can completely sever your liability. Miller leaned closer to his camera, his expression hardening. But Carter, we cannot just file a report with the State Environmental Quality Board and wait. If a local county sheriff rolls up to that gate in a marked cruiser with his lights flashing, Arthur will panic. The transport drivers will scatter into the wind, the corporate waste brokers will erase their paper trails, and the dirty money will vanish. Arthur will claim he was simply the victim of random illegal dumping by unknown third parties. He keeps his cash, and you will spend the next 10 years in federal court trying to prove your innocence against a legion of corporate lawyers. We need a surgical strike. We need heavy federal artillery. Who are we calling? I asked. I am bypassing the state jurisdiction entirely, Miller said. I am initiating a joint agency federal referral. I'm bringing in the EPA Criminal Investigation Division, and because of that $85,000 cash truck purchase, I'm notifying IRS criminal investigation. Most civilians view the Environmental Protection Agency as a bureaucratic group of mild-mannered scientists who test municipal water samples, measure smog levels, and hand out civil fines for littering. That is a dangerous, fundamentally flawed misconception. The EPA Criminal Investigation Division, the EPA CID, is a fully federalized, heavily armed law enforcement agency. Their special agents graduate from the federal law enforcement training centers. They are sworn federal officers who carry Glock sidearms, execute midnight search warrants, and aggressively hunt down the worst ecological terrorists and corporate polluters in the country. They don't hand out administrative tickets. They hand out 15-year federal prison sentences, and when they raid a contaminated site, they do it wearing Level A hazmat suits and carrying M4 carbines. And the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit. They are the financial grim reapers of the United States government. They are the apex predators of the fiscal world. You can hide a body, and you can hide toxic waste in the woods, but you cannot hide $85,000 of raw, untaxed cash from a forensic accountant with a federal badge. They are the agency that takes down untouchable mob bosses when the FBI cannot find a murder weapon. If you have undeclared illicit cash, they will trace it, they will find it, and they will utilize civil asset forfeiture to take absolutely everything you own. To shift the total financial liability away from you and directly onto their corporate insurance policies and your uncle's personal assets, we need to catch them in flagrante delicto, Miller explained. We need the federal agents to witness the chemical transfer. We need the physical transport trucks on your property, and we need Arthur standing there taking the bribe money. But to get the task force in position and to secure the federal Title III surveillance warrants, we need time. And we need Arthur to feel completely, utterly secure. I will feed him a lie, I said. I will make him greedy. I terminated the secure uplink, left the skiff, and walked to a standard unclassified morale computer in the recreation tent. The execution of a psychological operation against your own blood is a strangely clinical process. I pulled up Arthur's last folksy, deceitful message. I stared at the fake timestamp-altered picture of the untouched green canopy, took a deep breath, and began to type. Uncle Arthur, I just got out of a brutal briefing with command. Things are heating up over here, and my unit's deployment has officially been extended by another 6 months. The operational tempo is increasing, and communication blackouts are going to become the norm for me moving forward. I likely won't be able to check emails or make phone calls for weeks at a time. I just wanted to say thank you. Knowing you are watching the farm, knowing the land is secure and exactly how my grandfather left it is the only thing keeping me sane right now. Keep the gates locked. I will touch base when the Army finally lets me breathe. Stay warm out there. Carter. I clicked send. It was a perfectly crafted, highly weaponized piece of bait. It was wrapped in duty exhaustion and blind familial trust. To a normal person, it was a sad update from a tired soldier. But to a chronic opportunist like Arthur, it was a massive, uncontested window of time. It was a green light to maximize his profits before the deep freeze of the Montana winter shut down the access roads. He replied less than 12 hours later. Carter, I am so sorry to hear about the extension, but we are all so damn proud of you. Don't you worry about a single thing back here. I went out and checked the locks just yesterday. The forest is quiet and the water is running clear. You just keep your head down and stay safe. The farm will be waiting for you completely untouched. God bless. I read the words completely untouched and felt a cold, jagged spike of pure contempt. He was going to use my extended combat deployment to coordinate the largest, most toxic dumps of the season. He thought he was a mastermind, running a brilliant, invisible empire in the shadows. He had no idea he had just walked into a heavily orchestrated federal kill zone. While I continued flying close air support missions over a hostile desert, the bureaucratic machinery of the federal government moved with terrifying surgical precision. They didn't arrive in marked white government SUVs with flashing lights. They treated my grandfather's land like a hostile foreign territory. Under the cover of a moonless night, 7,000 miles away from my deployment, a specialized tactical surveillance team of special agents from the EPA CID infiltrated my property. They didn't use the main access road. They hiked in 3 miles through the dense, unforgiving backcountry timber, completely bypassing Arthur's cheap padlocks. They operated under strict blackout conditions, using military-grade night vision goggles to avoid snapping a single branch or leaving any physical trace of their presence. When they reached the edge of the massive bulldozed clearing, they didn't make an arrest. They built a trap. With absolute precision, the federal agents installed heavily concealed, motion-activated infrared trail cameras high up in the canopy of the oldest pine trees. These military-grade optics were angled directly at the mud ruts, perfectly calibrated to capture license plates, Department of Transportation registry numbers, and facial recognition data in pitch blackness. But they didn't just watch the dirt. They wired the water. Environmental technicians clad in Level B protective gear slipped into the runoff trenches and installed automated subsurface water sampling devices, auto-samplers, directly into the mud. These sensors were calibrated to detect the precise chemical signature of heavy industrial solvents. The moment foreign toxins hit the soil, the subsurface sensors would instantly vacuum up time-stamped vials of the contaminated runoff and beam a chemical alert directly to an EPA server in Denver. This created an undeniable court-admissible chain of custody, linking the poison being dumped directly to the corporate refineries that produced it. Along the deeply rutted dirt road, they buried microseismic ground sensors just beneath the gravel. These sensors were specifically calibrated to ignore the weight of native wildlife or standard passenger vehicles. They would only trigger when a commercial vehicle weighing over 30,000 pounds rolled over them. Simultaneously, forensic accountants from IRS Criminal Investigation began quietly dismantling Arthur's financial life. They didn't freeze his accounts that would immediately tip him off. Instead, they placed silent federal monitors on every single transaction he made. They tracked the $85,000 cash purchase of his truck back to a series of structured, under-the-table cash deposits at a local credit union. They were building a massive, legally bulletproof indictment for felony tax evasion and money laundering, brick by undeniable federal brick. For 3 agonizing weeks, I maintained complete radio silence. I didn't send another email. I didn't check his social media. I just sat in the Tactical Operations Center during my off hours, waiting for the trap to spring. I needed Arthur to feel invincible. I needed him to stand in the middle of my grandfather's dying forest, breathing in the toxic fumes, believing he was the smartest man in the world. I needed him looking down at his blood money, completely unaware of the federal storm gathering in the dark tree line right behind him. It was 0200 hours on a Friday night when the encrypted terminal finally chimed. The temperature in Montana was dropping to near freezing. The waste brokers were making their final massive push before the snow fell. Captain Miller sent a single direct message. Seismic ground sensors tripped. Multiple heavy commercial vehicles approaching the perimeter. The target is on site. Execution phase authorized. I set my coffee mug down on the steel desk. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the blue glow of the monitor, a sense of absolute, icy calm washing over my entire body. The philosophy of silence had run its course. The federal web was fully woven, the jaws were locked open, and my uncle was about to step directly into the teeth. There is a specific, profound arrogance that infects criminals who operate in deep isolation. When you stand in the absolute darkness of a Montana forest at 2 in the morning, miles from the nearest paved highway or municipal street lamp, the silence tricks you into believing you are completely untouchable. You begin to believe that the canopy of ancient pine trees will hide your sins, and that the freezing, unyielding earth will gladly swallow your secrets. You become so intensely focused on the immediate gratification of your own greed that you fail to notice the absolute suffocating stillness that always precedes a catastrophic ambush. At exactly 02:15 hours deep in the heavy timber of my grandfather's estate, my Uncle Arthur was experiencing the absolute peak of that arrogance. I was not physically there to witness the raid. I was 7,000 miles away, staring at a decrypted tactical monitor in a military operations center. But the subsequent federal after-action reports, the sworn affidavits from the arresting agents, and the high-definition footage captured by the concealed canopy cameras provided a surgical, second-by-second breakdown of his destruction. The temperature in the forest had plummeted to 28 degrees. A thick, icy fog was rolling off the canopy, masking the heavy, industrial groan of 3 massive, unmarked 18-wheelers lumbering down the deeply rutted dirt road. They parked in a staggered formation at the edge of the hollowed-out clearing, their heavy diesel engines idling, sending thick plumes of gray exhaust into the pristine air. These were not standard commercial haulers. They carried no Department of Transportation registry numbers. Their corporate logos had been hastily painted over with flat black primer. They were ghost ships of the industrial underworld, loaded to the absolute brim with thousands of gallons of highly caustic, unregulated chemical sludge. Arthur was standing at the edge of the tree line, leaning casually against the polished black quarter panel of his $85,000 Ford F-350 King Ranch. He was wearing his signature faded Carhartt jacket, his breath pluming in the freezing air, grinning with the unearned confidence of a lottery winner. A man in a heavy thermal coat stepped out of the lead transport truck. He was a regional waste broker for a mid-tier chemical refinery, a corporate parasite who made a highly lucrative living bypassing federal disposal regulations. He walked over to Arthur, completely ignoring any pretense or small talk, and handed him a heavy, olive-drab canvas duffel bag. Arthur didn't even bother to count it. The trail cameras captured him unzipping the canvas just enough to see the thick, rubber-banded stacks of undeclared $100 bills. $35,000 in raw cash. The final payout for the final dump of the season. He zipped the bag shut, tossed it casually into the passenger seat of his pristine truck, and gave the waste broker a thumbs up. The broker signaled his drivers. The heavy hydraulic power takeoff valves on the transport trailers whined to life with a mechanical shriek. Thick, black, heavily reinforced hoses were dragged through the mud and aimed directly into the natural depression that fed the subterranean aquifer. Thousands of gallons of caustic, highly toxic industrial waste began to violently vomit onto my grandfather's soil. The foul, acidic stench of heavy solvents, ammonia, and heavy metals instantly overpowered the natural scent of the pine trees. Arthur stood there watching the earth turn into a toxic swamp, completely unbothered. He reached into his cab and pulled out a steel thermos of coffee, unscrewed the lid, and took a sip. He didn't hear the tactical boots moving through the heavy brush. He didn't hear the synchronized disengaging of rifle safeties. He just took another sip of his coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that the darkest perimeter of the forest was now entirely populated by federal agents. When the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division executes a felony raid on an active hazardous waste dumping site, they do not announce themselves with wailing police sirens. Sirens give criminals time to run into the woods. Sirens give corporate drivers time to lock their reinforced cab doors and destroy their digital manifests. Federal agents do not make noise. They rely on the paralyzing, overwhelming shock of sudden, total tactical dominance. They simply flip the switch. Without a single microsecond of warning, the absolute pitch-black darkness of the Montana forest was violently eradicated. Dozens of military-grade, million-candle-power tactical floodlights flared simultaneously from the tree line, cutting through the freezing fog with blinding, disorienting intensity. The raid was executed with the overwhelming, synchronized violence of action characteristic of an elite military operation. "Federal agents, cut the engines. Do not move. Show your hands." The voice booming from the tactical bullhorn didn't sound like a local county sheriff asking for cooperation. It was a crushing, synthesized command that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. Arthur dropped his thermos. The scalding coffee splashed against the chrome rims of his new truck. He threw his hands into the air, his eyes wide with a suddenly realized, unmitigated terror, completely blinded by the intersecting beams of tactical light. Special agents from the EPA CID poured out of the woodline. Half of the assault element was wearing standard tactical body armor and carrying suppressed short-barreled M4 carbines, moving with aggressive fluid precision to rip the terrified transport drivers out of their elevated cabs and press them face first into the freezing mud. The other half of the element looked like something out of a biological warfare nightmare. They were environmental tactical technicians clad entirely in Level A, fully encapsulated hazmat suits with self-contained breathing apparatuses. They moved methodically toward the pumping hoses, manually wrenching the massive hydraulic shutoff valves, killing the toxic flow with a violent shudder of the steel pipes. Arthur didn't even have the opportunity to speak. Two heavily armored federal agents grabbed him by the collar of his faded jacket, swept his legs, and slammed him chest first against the hood of his beloved F-350. As they wrenched his arms behind his back and ratcheted heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists, the illusion of his untouchable empire shattered completely. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, as the initial shock wore off, Arthur's survival instincts finally kicked in. Like a cornered animal, he immediately tried to deflect the blame. He began screaming frantically at the arresting agents, his voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "You can't arrest me. I don't own this land. I'm just the caretaker. Check the county deed. The property belongs to my niece. She's in the Army. It's her land. She told me to lease it out. She's the legal owner." It was a desperate, sickening attempt to throw my life directly into the federal wood chipper to save his own skin. He was banking on the terrifying legal doctrine of the Superfund law. He knew that the EPA held the legal owner of the land completely responsible for the contamination. He thought he could use my uniform and my name as a human shield. He didn't realize I had anticipated that exact betrayal 10 months ago, sitting in a sterile JAG office. A tall, broad-shouldered EPA CID special agent in charge stepped forward from the blinding glare. He walked directly up to Arthur, staring at him with a level of cold, bureaucratic contempt that can only be found in a federal investigator. He pulled a heavy laminated folder from his tactical vest and held it up directly to Arthur's face. Displayed in high definition on a waterproof tablet was the digitally scanned, notarized copy of the exact limited power of attorney I had forced Arthur to sign before my deployment. "Article 4, Section B, Arthur," the agent said, his voice completely devoid of empathy. "The legal owner of this property explicitly forbade you from leasing, altering, or operating commercial machinery on this land. We also have the extracted metadata from the fake photographs you've been emailing a deployed service member to actively conceal your operation. She didn't authorize this. You went rogue. You committed felony fraud, criminal trespass, and you severely violated the Clean Water Act. Chief Warrant Officer Carter is claiming the innocent landowner defense under federal law. You are standing here entirely on your own." The blood completely drained from Arthur's face. The realization of his total, inescapable isolation hit him harder than the physical impact of the handcuffs. But the physical cage was only half of his punishment. As Arthur sagged against the hood of his truck, a second group of individuals emerged from the tree line. They weren't wearing hazmat gear, and they weren't carrying rifles. They were wearing dark, tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with 3 highly specific yellow letters. IRS-CI. The financial Grim Reapers had arrived to finish the execution. A female special agent from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit walked casually over to Arthur's prized $85,000 custom Ford truck. She didn't ask for the keys. She simply pulled a brightly colored heavy-duty federal seizure sticker and slapped it directly across the driver's side windshield. "What are you doing?" Arthur shrieked, struggling violently against the grips of the EPA agents, his eyes locked on his vehicle in absolute horror. "That is my personal vehicle. You can't touch that. I bought it completely legally. It has nothing to do with this." The IRS agent turned to him, her expression completely unbothered, her voice dripping with forensic precision. "You purchased that vehicle with $85,000 in structured undeclared cash, Arthur," she stated, reading off a digital clipboard. "We have heavily monitored every single transaction you've made for the past 3 weeks. The $35,000 in cash currently sitting on your passenger seat, the money in your hidden credit union accounts, and the asset value of this vehicle are the direct illicit proceeds of illegal commercial waste dumping. This constitutes felony tax evasion, money laundering, and major fraud against the United States." She looked at him with dead, completely apathetic eyes. "Under federal civil asset forfeiture laws, this truck no longer belongs to you. It is now the property of the United States Treasury. We are also executing an immediate federal freeze on your personal checking accounts, your savings, and your primary residential home to satisfy your incoming tax penalties. You are utterly, entirely bankrupt." Arthur stopped struggling. His knees gave out. He collapsed directly into the freezing, toxic mud he had been paid to ignore, sobbing uncontrollably. The rugged, arrogant opportunist was completely shattered. He was hyperventilating, realizing in a single, devastating moment that the niece he thought was blind, the soldier he thought was distracted, had meticulously orchestrated his complete financial and legal destruction from a laptop 7,000 miles away. The legal fallout over the next 6 months was an absolute massacre. Because of the massive scale of the chemical dumping, the EPA immediately invoked CERCLA, the Superfund law. They brought in environmental engineers, ground-penetrating radar, and heavy excavation equipment. The preliminary assessment was catastrophic. The estimated cost of the environmental remediation, excavating the dead soil, chemically treating the subterranean water table, and monitoring the aquifer for the next decade was calculated at exactly $8.4 million. Under normal circumstances, the federal government would have come directly for me. But my defense was completely impenetrable. Captain Miller presented the Department of Justice with my limited power of attorney and the digital forensics. The EPA formally designated me an innocent landowner. I was granted total 100% immunity from all civil and financial liability. The $8 million crosshairs shifted entirely off my back and locked directly onto Arthur and the chemical corporation. The Department of Justice pierced the corporate veil of the refinery, forcing the executives into immediate bankruptcy to pay for the cleanup. As for Arthur, he pleaded guilty in federal court to multiple felony violations of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, aggravated wire fraud, and severe tax evasion. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. In the federal system, there is no early parole. He went into federal custody with absolutely nothing. No house, no truck, no retirement, and an outstanding multi-million-dollar civil judgment from the EPA that is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. It is a financial anchor that will actively garnish any minimum wage commissary paycheck he ever earns for the rest of his natural life. He was quite literally erased from the financial system. 14 months later, my deployment finally ended. I stepped off a commercial airliner in Montana, rented a 4-wheel drive SUV, and drove out to the property. I didn't need a key for the gate anymore. The rusted padlocks Arthur had used were gone, replaced by heavy government-issued chains and massive aluminum signs reading, "Warning, Federal Superfund Remediation Site, no trespassing." I parked on the shoulder, unlatched the pedestrian gate, and walked a mile into the deep timber. When I reached the center of the property, the visual was jarring. The beautiful, pristine clearing I remembered from my youth was gone. In its place was a massive, highly sterilized industrial operation. Heavy white containment tents stood over excavated trenches. Large yellow water filtration silos hummed quietly in the background, purifying the aquifer and returning clean water to the earth. The physical damage Arthur had inflicted on the land was severe, and it will take decades for the root systems to fully heal. But as I stood there on the edge of the excavation site, looking out at the heavy green canopy that remained, I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of victory. The cancer had been detected isolated and violently excised before it could become terminal. The ecosystem was bleeding, but it was surviving. And most importantly, the parasite that tried to kill it had been permanently removed from the host. Family is not guaranteed to be resilient, and it is certainly not guaranteed to be loyal. Some branches of the family tree do not bear fruit, they only carry disease. And when you identify a parasite feeding off the roots of your legacy, you do not negotiate with it. You do not offer it a second chance, and you do not warn it that you are coming. You simply introduce it to a predator much larger, much more ruthless, and entirely unforgiving. He thought the miles made me blind. He thought the silence meant I was ignorant. I used a satellite to watch him bury his own freedom in the dirt, and I used the absolute, unyielding, crushing weight of the federal government to foreclose on his future. Family betrayal, and the truth that comes home.